Sport Business. Global Sports Intelligence.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Sport Business Podcast, getting you up to speed with the stories powering the global sports industry. I'm Catherine Davies, America's Bureau Chief of Sport Business, and I'm the host of this weekly podcast. Now, after last week's deep dive into two headline sponsorship topics, today it's the turn of our media experts, Martin Ross and Frank Dunn, who are joining me to bring their usual incisive analysis, this time on the subject of DAZN, the global sports streamer, which has just released its accounts for the 2024 financial year. Martin and Frank will give us their take on those numbers and how they see the future shaping up for the would-be Spotify of sport. And then Martin will stay on the line to lend his insightful eye to the finances in golf in light of this week's revelation that the PGA Tour's shortfall funding to its European counterpart has exceeded £21 million. And this at the same time as LIV Golf, the Saudi-backed rival golf tour, reported that it lost nearly £462 million in 2024. While we're digesting the enormity of all those numbers, we'll also hear from our global news reporter, Jon Rest, who spent the week speaking to the movers and shakers in New York. And we'll also take a more lighthearted look at what's coming our way in the week ahead, including a Champions League wedding and where Bad Bunny is at next. To you, our listeners, don't forget to leave us your feedback on today's podcast in a review on the Apple Podcast and Spotify platforms. Let us know if you like what you're hearing and what you'd like to know more about. Now, let's move straight on to our first topic for the day. I'm joined now by Martin Ross, our global news editor, and Frank Dunn, our sport business editor at large. Welcome back to the podcast, gentlemen.
Hi, Catherine.
We're quite the international team, aren't we? I won't tell you what time it is out here on the West Coast in Vancouver, but Martin, this is a leisurely mid-afternoon chat for you up in Glasgow. And Frank, you're nearly done your day down in Bologna. So I haven't spoken to either of you in a couple of weeks. What's been happening in your neck of the woods since the last time we spoke?
Well, tonight is the return of Gianni's week of football. I will be at, tonight is Thursday, we're speaking of. I will be at Scotland against Greece tonight, big game. And then, yes, I do enjoy Gianni's week of football until about the Tuesday. And then by the time you get to the Tuesday, when your team's played twice, it's hard to get up for the back end of fixtures. Republic of Ireland v Armenia, for example. Sorry, Frank. But yeah, Gianni's week of football ahead.
What about you, Frank? Where have you been and what are you looking forward to in the week ahead?
Well, I prefer to play than watch. So I've got six-a-side tonight and then heading off to London for the weekend. I have to be honest, I almost never watch qualifiers. Perhaps I shouldn't admit that. I love tournaments. I love the Euros. I love the World Cup. But I do find qualifiers deadly boring. I'm sorry, Gianni. I'm sorry, Gilo. I'm sorry to everyone who's involved in commercializing qualifiers, but not my cup of tea. It's not something I make a date for.
If you're Scottish, it's your only chance to watch them, so you really have to watch them.
Only chance of the occasional win.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I'll wait for the big event.
Hopefully I'll be at the big event in June and July. We'll see if I have any luck with the tickets. Well, let's move straight along. Martin, this week you wrote an exclusive on DAZN, the global streaming platform owned by billionaire Len Blavatnik's Access Industries, and how it has posted an $878 million loss for its 2024 financial year. And that's the good news, isn't it? Now, take us through the main points and also the level of ongoing support from Access Industries. If you could break down those revenue streams and costs for us.
Yeah, we did do an exclusive by about 15 minutes. Tuesday was a very early start for me, but we got it over the line. And I thought it was a chance to talk about DAZN's finances. I certainly don't want to just fixate on the loss, and it's always kind of a stick to beat DAZN with, but maybe we'll use this as a chance to open up the conversation around the last 12 months at DAZN as well, which has been in some ways a bit of a game changer as to where they're going. I think this year's accounts, will look very different, although I think we'll treat with some skepticism maybe the new sound bites about profitability in 26. Yeah, the nuts and bolts, just as a start-off point, the operating loss narrowed to $878 million. This is for 2024, but DAZN was once again dependent on significant funding from Access Industries, of Len Blavatnik company, in the shape of ordinary and preference share funding. That was taking up to $7 billion, the total funding that Access has provided over 9 years. It was $587 million in 2024. The deficit's down 36% on last year. Revenues are up 11% to $3.2 billion. Largely due to some subscription increases, but also crucially increasing the price of subscriptions in core markets. So the operating costs are once again down, and really just finally there was a note in there which was interesting around a letter of intent that Access has provided that it will be able to put in place more funding for DAZN this year. That has not been used to date, which is interesting as they try and move away from that model and look to external investors and so on. And just a final line on sort of revenue breakdown. The bulk of the revenues, $3.12 billion, is from DAZN's, in inverted commas, direct-to-consumer business. Now, this means direct-to-consumer subscription sales, it means distribution monies, it means ad revenue, it means betting. So that is up 11%. Year over year. The remaining money, which is $63.1 million, that comes from the Broadcast Partnerships Division, which is the unit that services the JVs with FIBA basketball and the WTA. That was up $7.6 million, largely on the back of sort of competition cycle effect. So there we go. There's the numbers, and we can maybe dive into what it all means a bit more.
Well, the last 12 months have been very significant for DAZN in many respects. And Frank, you've written a lot about this, particularly about the Club World Cup rights and Saudi investment, the Foxtel takeover, thoughts for whether there's going to be an IPO or not. The Club World Cup was said to be a new model for sport. Is this really true? We don't know a lot about it, really, do we? Other than apparently 2.7 billion people watched it.
This is a very boring answer, but I think it might be too early to tell, because I think there are two things that you alluded to that happened around the same time, which was buying the rights to the Club World Cup for $1 billion or somewhere around there. And at the same time, getting a stake from the Saudis for around the same value, for 5%, and creating this joint venture. And so the Club World Cup was going to be potentially a game changer for DAZN. And they went about it in a different way to everything they'd done so far, which, I mean, they're a subscription business. And as we said, from the results, that's where their revenue comes from. But the idea of going free to air around the world, making this available free to everybody on the back of registration, was something new. And what was interesting, I think, is they went around the world selling certain games in certain territories to local broadcasters, primarily as promotion for what they were doing. And when it was first announced, it was said by FIFA and by DAZN that they were going to make the Club World Cup available to free-to-air channels around the world. In the end, free-to-air channels, not many of them took it, but loads of pay television channels took it around the world, which I think is really interesting because it goes against all of the received wisdom that basically I've ever had in terms of, where the value lies for a pay television company. There was some value maybe in terms of defending against churn. But if you think about what pay television companies normally spend their money on, they like to have some level of exclusivity, and they like to have something which will drive subscriber numbers. Not only was the entire Club World Cup on DAZN, it was on DAZN free. So if I had been the head bean counter at one of these pay television companies, I'd have been saying to my guys, are you serious? You want me to pay for this when the whole thing is here free? I couldn't really get my head around that, but we understand that they made somewhere between $140 and $170 million through sub-licensing, mostly to pay television, about half of which we think was across the Americas, North and South. It was Mark Watson, actually, the chief commercial officer of DAZN, who actually used that phrase after the competition when talking to us, the new model. And the new model being this combination of free-to-air and sub-licensing of rights, creating distribution agreements, creating partnerships. I think what we have to say so far is that there is no evidence of any major pivot towards the free-to-air model by DAZN since the Club World Cup. I've not seen any sign that there's going to be a major structural shift in the way their business works. And the numbers that we've been hearing today seem to suggest that there's been no real underlying change in how their business works. And I think a couple of other things that we expected to happen on the back of the Club World Cup. I mean, the primary objective for DAZN with making this competition free was to create new customers through registration, not paying customers, but to create people whose data they had, to create this huge big database, this global database. And the logic would be that once you've created this global audience who are paying nothing, who are just simply giving DAZN their name and address and a few details, then you follow up in those markets, the markets where they've been really successful, you follow up by acquiring media rights by developing your product in those markets. And you can look around the world and you can see the obvious markets where they would have done well, which is where there are teams. The UK, they would have done well. Brazil, France, where there was a team that did well, there would have been a lot of signups, unquestionably. We don't know the number. I mean, I've not seen DAZN publish a number anywhere. I've not seen this being shared, and as far as I can see, it's not in the latest results, the number of people who actually signed up free of charge on the back of the Club World Cup. But the logic should have been, okay, we've got all of these new signups. Now let's lock them in by making really attractive sports rights available in those markets. So it's expected that there would be some kind of targeted acquisition strategy on those markets. There have been a small handful of deals. I mean, there have been a few Serie A deals. There's been a distribution deal for the Ligue 1 Plus channel in France. But this big kind of spree to really lock in those customers and convert them to paying customers, I haven't seen that. So there's a couple of things, I think, that on the basis of that competition we expected to see, which we haven't seen. And I think that probably a third thing that we expected to see around the time there was a strategic relationship between the Saudis, PIF and Surge, and DAZN through the creation of this joint venture. We expect to see DAZN MENA being really aggressive or potentially aggressive, establishing themselves in that marketplace. So there's three things I think that I certainly expected to be a follow-on from the Club World Cup, none of which have happened yet.
Yeah, keen to pick up on a couple of those points, Frank. And yeah, DAZN MENA is particularly interesting as to what's happening or not happening at the moment. I feel so far it's been a bit of a kind of misnomer, the Club World Cup, as you say, around the free offering. That's not to say it hasn't been a success. You mentioned the sub-licensing media rights revenues there, the ad revenues on top of that. Obviously, the whole dynamics of how that deal came around means it's not necessarily kind of straight up 1 billion rights acquisition that has to be monetized with no other factors at play. But yeah, there's hardly been any, to my mind, haven't been any other premium rights examples. The freemium model that DAZN has used has largely, until the Club World Cup, was largely around mid and lower tier sport, a lot of which showcase events in Saudi Arabia as a precursor to the investment from Surge Sports to really showcase a light on the region and sports that were going to the region, putting something in place ahead of the creation of DAZN MENA. I mean, anecdotally, I've heard of some maybe football leagues. Austrian Bundesliga is a good example. Recently went into their tender thinking, well, maybe we can get some challenge around international rights from DAZN because they would put it out freemium around the world, that kind of stuff. They wanted to build up a football vertical globally and have done so with some Serie A highlights, I think. Is it La Liga highlights as well? So they're starting to do that, but not around a big premium property. The premium rights acquisitions have continued in other respects. Interestingly, from a geography point of view, the US being one of them, and we've spoken about this in a previous podcast, that sort of Spanish language rights, particular in the US, Champions League and others, have been acquired and a focus.
I think in that respect, there's a number of leagues in South America particularly that are moving away from their model of selling all their rights to a single broadcaster because that's not really working for them. Thinking of Chile and Uruguay, for example. And some of the people I spoke to had said, well, they would really be looking for someone the likes of Netflix, and they always mentioned DAZN to come in, perhaps because of that Spanish language vertical in the States. But it hasn't happened, and I don't think it is going to happen from what I've heard. But there's the other interesting point to look at, Frank, is an IPO. There's been some talk of an IPO, hasn't there? But we don't know much about the plans of DAZN other than that they're open to strategic investment. But it's not the best environment right now, is it? Or what can you tell me?
I mean, to be honest, we've been hearing this for, I don't know, at least 5 years. And every time it's raised, somebody says, well, we're not going to do it immediately, but we're not ruling it out. It might be something we do in the next couple of years. And we've been hearing the same thing. The truth is we don't know. I mean, it's been mooted as a possible exit for Len for at least 5 or 6 years. The last couple of years have not been the best time, really, for an IPO in terms of the macro indicators. I read recently, I was doing some research around private equity, and I read that 2024 was the worst year ever for IPOs, or at least for a couple of decades, in terms of the number of IPOs that got away. 2025 is showing an increase, 17% up year on year compared to last year. So 2024 was the worst time to IPO. Things are getting better. But generally, I mean, the macro economics are not fantastic. I mean, interest rates remain stubbornly high. Today, We are all aware that there's signs of possibly ceasefire in Gaza, which is great news in terms of security in the Middle East. But we still have this war going on in Europe. So there is still uncertainty. A lot of the things which affect global markets, a lot of the negative indicators, they're still out there. So it's not a brilliant time to get an IPO away. And I don't expect that to happen anytime soon. But, officially the position is we're looking at it, we're talking to people. I would say that if they can get another institutional investor, or if they can even get the Saudis to up their stake, that might be a preferable short-term alternative.
Yeah, I mean, the official line from Shai Segev, CEO of DAZN, to the Financial Times this week was essentially, as you say, they've trod this path before. They're continuing to look at public or private investment, and IPO remains possible. That there had been talks with investors in the US about potential listing, but I go back to January and they were talking about a search for institutional investors. That's come to fruition with Surge, not others that we're aware of, but there is a recognition from DAZN that they need more capital to grow and to invest to where they want to get to. The target is now this 200 billion Spotify of sport, or it was earlier this year, which it was gone from the Netflix of sport. There is appetite, I think, from institutional investors, certainly as has been shown. What Shai said to the FT was that this business has a very big potential to generate a lot of free cash. Happily, we've now reached that point and shareholders have put a lot of investment in. So that's the direction they're heading. But as Frank says, still no clarity on whether that is really going to be an IPO or not.
If you look at the figures that you just shared with us earlier, this is still a business which is losing close on $1 billion a year. So they still have to find someone who's prepared to take that off Len's hands. And as you mentioned, one of the figures that you quoted earlier, he's so far pumped $7 billion into making this work. So who out there, whether it's the Saudis or whether it's private equity, who out there is going to take this baby off Len's hands, which is losing $1 billion a year? It's not an easy sale. There are lots of positive indicators about potential growth and about driving cash and these other factors which are important to investors. But so it's still a challenge to find a major investor prepared to take this off Len's hands.
Yeah, the great unknown, as you mentioned earlier, I suppose, is the impact of this huge data capture from the Club World Cup and what that means in terms of monetizing it. By all accounts, and it did, viewing figure-wise, in terms of data point of view and customer point of view. We don't know how many new customers they've brought on board for sure, but I think broadly speaking, people regard the tournament as having been a success for DAZN.
I have a question for you. Frank, you'd mentioned that they had moved from the concept of a Netflix of sports more towards a Spotify of sports. That suggests to me, if you have Spotify, you have access to everything, whereas Netflix is a package of rights to films and series that they've acquired, but they don't have everything because Apple has other things. Spotify has everything. If you want to listen to music, you go to Spotify and it's all there. So DAZN doesn't have everything, and it sounds like they're unlikely to be able to find the funding to acquire everything. Why that model? Or why that term, I guess?
I think business is about two completely different things. One is the facts and the figures, the reality, the bottom line. The other is the PR message that you create around it. You can call it what you like. You can stick any name on it that you want to. Ultimately, the figures tell the story. And any institutional investor, whether it's a private equity company, any serious potential investor is going to be looking at the numbers. It doesn't matter what moniker they stick on it this month. The numbers tell the story. So, I think that it's irrelevant, really. And also, I think I understand why they do that. I understand why they need to have a catchy phrase. But I think in terms of the real world of the kind of people who are going to be looking at maybe pumping billions, they're not going to be fooled by that either way.
If we come back in a year's time on the podcast and we're talking about DAZN, then what do you think the 2025 accounts will look like? If you look into your crystal ball, do you think there's going to be a change, a positive change? Will we be in the same where we don't know a lot and they're picking up rights here and there? What do you think? What's your vision for the next 12 months, if you have one?
I think the really interesting question going forward about DAZN and how it fits into that whole ecosystem of global players. We've been hearing that UEFA is going to be considering making one match available per week to a global streamer. Now, for me, if DAZN wants to be in that company, if it wants to play in that water with those guys and consider itself to be a Netflix or a Spotify, if it's a real contender, then it'll be the one that wins that package of rights.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because, as much as the Club World Cup was a global showcase, as we've said, that there aren't any other examples of that. And DAZN as a business still really is a premium rights in its core markets business, and whether it can make those numbers work. When we're here in a year's time, we will probably be looking at $5 billion in revenues is the latest estimation. Interestingly, that was the noise was it was going to be, or the noises from DAZN was that it was going to be 6 billion when we spoke to them maybe 9 months ago. So that has changed. And the profitability line, Shai has said to the FT that the group will be profitable in 2026. So, we have to take him at his word, or do we? But, let's take him at his word for that. He says margins are improving. He says key markets will be profitable this year in 2025. The difficulty with the profitability discussion is the nuance. DAZN always talks about markets being profitable and an increase in underlying profitability. That's how they publicly, anyway, measure profitability. Now, I'm not an auditor, but underlying profitability is a profit calculation that excludes one-off exceptional items, non-recurring items. It's effectively, in my eyes, how you're sort of trading day to day. So if that's improving, it's clearly a good sign, but it doesn't mean bottom line that they are profitable in these markets. Now, if he's saying that they are profitable by all metrics as a group level in 2026, then that's a huge change. Let's see.
You're talking about this projection of 5 billion revenues for 2025, and we've just come off the back of 3.19, which was an 11% increase. To go from a 3.19 to 5 is a 65% increase in a year. As they say in Italy, come on.
Well, I think we could talk on about this for some time, but we will regroup in 12 months and perhaps sooner. And I'm aware, Frank, that you're going off to coach football now. So we're going to wrap this up. Thank you both very much. We'll see you again soon, Frank. We'll see you at SportTel in a couple of weeks. And Martin, you and I are going to be right back to talk about some golf numbers. We're going to take a short break now. We'll be right back.
Stay ahead in the business of sport with Sport Business newsletters, covering the biggest stories driving the industry, delivered straight to your inbox at no cost. Sign up today at sportbusiness.com.
Welcome back to the Sport Business Podcast, bringing you the latest sport business industry news. Now, before we move on to our next section on the financials of golf, we'll break up the numbers with some quick news from across the pond. Our global news reporter, Jon Rest, has been in New York this week, meeting with key people in the business, and he's recorded a summary of what he's been hearing and what's coming up. Let's listen to what he has to say. Over to you, Jon.
Hi, Catherine. I assumed you'd be missing me, so I'm sending you a dispatch from the Big Apple. I'm pounding the streets of New York to bring you the news from the US sports market. And it's really news of M&A, really. People are talking a lot about Paramount, Skydance, the money that they've kind of been putting into the media rights industry recently, and some big TKO deals. But more so, what's next for them? And Warner Brothers Discovery assets seemingly on the market. That is looking like a battle between Paramount, Skydance, and Netflix. Who's going to win that battle? It remains to be seen, but it's going to certainly change the sports media rights movement going forward here in the US. Elsewhere, it's really, again, talking about private equity and in college sports. You would have seen on Sport Business and the On The Money newsletter the story of the Big Ten potentially opening up to private equity investment and all that means. A couple of people I spoke to kind of a bit more cagey on that, and the reason behind it saying, the realignment in the US college sports industry over the last 18 months or so, what does it mean for some of these colleges? Are they even going to be around in 5, 6, 7 years? And that level of uncertainty is not great for an investor, so keep your eyes peeled there. And then finally, I guess the big story, staying with private equity, is where the next lot of funds are coming from. We've seen the US family owners perhaps squeezed out in certain American big league sports by the private equity firms. Well, now we're looking actually at kind of uber billionaires from the Middle East and India coming in and really wanting to get a bit of the pie. So keep your eyes peeled there for future deals. I think that could be where the next wave of financial investment is coming from into US sports. And finally, I went to the Yankees game yesterday. Still reeling from spending $16 on a beer. That is a revenue line in its own for the P&L. Maybe a couple of Premier League clubs will be looking at the prices of their beers and putting them up because, I felt that one in the wallet. They lost. Bad news for MLB. They have no New York, big media market, no New York teams left in the playoffs. But anyway, that's all from me. I hopefully will be back next week safe and sound. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jon. You've always got your finger on the pulse of the business. Safe travels back to the UK, and no doubt we'll hear much more as you get your feet back under your desk next week. Now, I've got Martin Ross back on the line to share his insights into the latest numbers coming out of professional golf, both the PGA Tour and its European counterpart, the DP World Tour, and LIV Golf, the Saudi-backed rival golf tour that launched in 2022. Martin, I think by now we all know that you're a bit of a golf fan, am I right?
Correct. Yes, I am. I'm also a big fan of Jon's background noise. That was sensational. I'm wondering whether I can put the window down here and we get a bit of Glasgow background noise, but we may lose our PG rating on the podcast, so that might not be the best idea. Quite a lot of shouting goes on outside my window.
Well, if we're lucky, we'll hear your dog barking, but that just adds a bit of color. Now, on to golf. You reported a year ago about the details of the PGA Tour shortfall funding provided to the European Tour, and that sum went up in 2024. Explain to the listeners, if you would, what it is, how it came about, and what it means for the European Tour looking ahead.
Yes, European Tour's finance came out recently. We did a news story on Monday. The really interesting bit, as you say, is the PGA Tour funding for the European Tour. So this is it was called an underpin. They've now called it an annual investment payment. It's essentially a shortfall funding to help cover increased prize money that has become necessary, obviously, for anyone who follows golf, to compete and stem the kind of flow of any more golfers going to LIV, the breakaway tour. So this is a financial agreement running for 5 years, this particular agreement from 23 to 27, part of the wider alliance in June 22. So that it did all sorts of things. It provided a pathway for top DP World Tour players to go to the PGA Tour. The PGA Tour got more equity in European Tour productions, take it to 40% of equity. And in many ways, European Tour, which certainly when I was growing up has a real rival of the PGA Tour in terms of players, in terms of, it aligned with the PGA Tour and gave up a bit of its competitiveness, if you like, to be honest, in the face of the growing threat from LIV. The number that's come out in the new accounts is that £21.5 million was provided in cash to the European Tour by the PGA Tour in 2024. That's up just about 10% on the figure. Last year, that's shortfall funding. It's an uncapped, it's a non-repayable sum, and it's determined by the European Tour's EBITDA. Yeah, as a result, an amount of prize money that has been agreed between the European Tour and the PGA Tour over a 5-year period. That will go up obviously each year. It went up to $148.5 million in 2024. It will go up again next year, and it's all designed, as I say, to keep the players together. I mean, what happens after 2027? I mean, the European Tour would tell you that obviously their alliance that they have runs till 2035. In due course, the sort of level of prize money will be determined for that and the associate support required. I mean, it's still quite a thing for a tour. It was a long time, in my eyes, a long time rival of PGA Tour needing financial support of another property in the market. If you consider it to other sport, it's quite unusual. It has, and we'll talk about this, string of losses in previous years. And of course, it is against the backdrop of whether a commercial merger will happen between the PGA Tour, the European Tour, and LIV. Yeah, an interesting development that the level of funding has gone up. We can maybe get into some of the details as to why that has been required.
Well, talking about the levels of funding, I'd like to know what you can tell me about the losses at the European Tour. How bad are they? And is it unusual for the group to report a loss? And while you're at it, can you talk about commercial revenue streams in what was not a Ryder Cup year? I just heard your dog bark in the background.
She's not a fan of operational losses. She's very much like my dad, who's an accountant. She likes to keep her books very tidy. Not a Ryder Cup year in 2024. 2023 European Ryder Cup year in Rome, different to a Ryder Cup in the US, which we've just had, which is run by the PGA of America. So the revenues kind of reflect that in Ryder Cup years. So it's difficult to make a comparison between a 2024 and a 2023. It's certainly not apples for apples. So, I mean, there may have been some headlines around, that operating loss has swelled. Yes, but asterisk. So yeah, the operating loss last year was £27.6 million, which is the highest they've had over the last 6-year period. But the EBITDA loss was £18.1 million. because there were higher operating costs. And then also, and this has been a fixture of the accounts over the last few years, there's a depreciation and amortization cost of $9.5 million, which has been similar over the last few years. That's related to taking the full ownership of European Tour productions from IMG and a bit boring stuff like the depreciation in value of IT equipment, vehicles and stuff. So as a result, well, if you look at the actual EBITDA loss, taking away the Ryder Cup money in this year and last year, it closed actually to £13.5 million in 2024 versus 19.7 million in 2023. The cash balance in terms of how much cash in the bank, they've got 57.6 million in 2024. That's down from 72 million. Just to touch on the revenues and how European Tour, I suppose, is performing, excluding the Ryder Cup. Well, they call them the Ryder Cup companies, but the revenue was 347.9 million in 2024, which is up 2% year over year. Basically improved sponsorship, improved what they call consumer revenue, which is ticketing, hospitality. Its merchandising sponsorship was up 15%, excluding sort of the Ryder Cup effect, if you like. Consumer was up 28%. Consumer is the one really related to the Two Circles deal. Two Circles has an 11-year deal with European Tour around ticketing, marketing, hospitality, and so on, data. The consumer revenue was 11.4 million. Last year's sponsorship much higher, of course. And there's been a bit of traction on sponsorship, largely parts to another alignment with the PGA Tour around giving introductions to new sponsors that were, our PGA Tour sponsors that European Tour's brought on board. Buffalo Trace Distillery is one of those. They've had other recent sponsorship deals, Clear Group, FedEx, J&W. But having said that, the Rolex deal expires this year. That will be interesting to see if it's renewed. There is a line in the account saying they're confident it will be. Long-term partner, been through thick and thin. If they renew, then that's a sign of ongoing trust and belief in the European Tour during unheralded circumstances, during, having lost some of their key players, having lost, could argue, obviously, some of the commercial traction to LIV and a bit of an unsure future.
Well, you've said it there, the elephant in the room. It could have all been very different for the European Tour if it had aligned with the Premier Golf League, which was a forerunner to LIV and not to the PGA Tour. Can you give us a bit of a history lesson on that, on how this alliance happened with the backdrop of LIV Golf launching in 2022?
Yeah, so Premier Golf League, which was a forerunner to LIV, essentially. It was backed by Rain Group. It was led by Andrew Gardner, kind of UK financier. Very similar in nature to what has been created by LIV, a sort of Formula One type team concept, disruptive. So we're going back now to about sort of 2019, 2020. At the same time, European Tour was also starting to host events in Saudi Arabia, had established ties with Saudi Arabian authorities under Keith Pelley. But coming down the line, was being met with competition as to where it goes. So European Tour was caught between whether to back and align with Premier Golf League in some way to create a golf tour, which would obviously be a huge threat to the PGA Tour, or to go with the PGA Tour. So that was the quandary. And I'm just going to read you a quick quote from Alan Shipnuck's very good book on the whole LIV dilemma, Live and Let Live by Alan Shipnuck. I don't mind giving him a nod because it is a good book. He is a quote from a PGL investor, we don't know who it is, but somebody that was investing in the PGL, regarding Jay Monahan, the commissioner at the time of the PGA Tour, and his approach to talks with the European Tour. He says that Monahan basically threatened to destroy the European Tour. He promised to take all the sponsors and said he would pump money into the purses of tour events played opposite the Euro Tour's flagship events so that all top Europeans stayed in the States. He might as well have parked tanks outside of Keith Pelley's office. Keith Pelley himself said, I think in terms of whether they nearly went with a PGL offer, he said had it been $400 or $500 million in cash, the sort of Rain-backed offer, and not $100 million in equity that they couldn't put into the prize fund, then they would have taken that offer at the time. So that's how close they came to aligning with a disruptive league that became the kind of the forerunner, if you like, to LIV. As we know, future was very different. The deal was done with PGA Tour, and as part of that deal, PGA Tour got 15% of equity in European Tour Productions for $85 million, and was able, in its mind, to try to stave off the threat coming from a rival league, and the European Tour wouldn't be able to sort of partner up in the same way with other leagues. It was a means of self-protection really for the PGA Tour, and has created a set of financial circumstances and financial support that's been required, as we've just discussed.
Well, one thing I wanted to ask you about was this proposed merger between the PGA Tour and LIV Golf. That was announced in June 2023, and we really haven't heard much more about that since then. But in the meantime, the PGA Tour has aligned with its new financial partners in the Strategic Sports Group. That's the likes of Fenway Sports Group, Mark Lazary, Jerry Cardinelli of Redbird Capital, and so forth, and their net worth of billions there. So there hasn't been much movement on a merger. The PGA Tour is still providing this funding for the European Tour. Are they playing a waiting game in the backdrop of LIV Golf's losses? What's going on there, do you think?
Well, I think people would be stunned if I did know the answer to this, given how few people at both tours knew about the framework agreement when it was announced. The sense, talking around, not people in golf and, around the tours, would be that it's not close. Having been supposedly close earlier this year, I remember Paul McGinley, who used to be in the European Tour board, making some remarks around feeling it might be close around the Masters. That didn't happen. Obviously, the PGA Tour, European Tour, LIV Tour continues to do their own business. We'll talk a bit about business that LIV's doing and its own financial results, which are super interesting. But no, I'm not getting any sense that it is close. And we are now obviously more than 2 years down the line. There was a theory that we would get to a place we could get to a place maybe where they're doing more content together, so they're not losing eyeballs. There was a feeling we would get to a place where LIV could exist as a team series in a PGA Tour calendar, and it could really own team golf because that's its kind of USP. That hasn't come to fruition yet. So, yeah, let's see.
Martin, you mentioned LIV Golf's finances, and I know you've had a peek into their recent reports. What do those numbers reveal to you? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, a lot of noise about this, as you can imagine, and I do like a caveat. I'm going to give you a couple of caveats, similar to when we were talking about DAZN earlier. When you're reporting and commenting on figures from the previous year, then a lot has changed since. The big thing being obviously having a new CEO and Scott O'Neill. Greg Norman has left. He was quite a divisive figure in golf, really. But I mean, the business is changing quite a lot. Even just this week, actually, they've announced various hires. The second caveat, I suppose, would be the way that they account. The figures that have come out for LIV Golf Limited, which is a UK-based company, it represents the international operations, if you like, the 7 international events, the revenue from those 7 being Mexico, Australia, Hong Kong, UK, Spain, Singapore, and Saudi Arabia. LIV Inc. in the US, whose figures haven't been published, is a separate entity. There were 7 events last year in the US. It is not a full picture of LIV's accounts. What it is a very good idea of where they get their commercial revenues from internationally. It is also not the whole loss figure. I mean, the loss figure, which is $462 million post-tax loss 2024, people have got, as you can imagine, extremely excited about this in the press. That's led to headlines about 1.1 billion loss, because those are the losses for the international unit if you add them up over 22, 23 and 24. Looking to add a bit of context into this conversation around, it is clearly a huge loss, but I mean, yeah, I've never heard a soundbite from LIV or from PIF saying this will be a profitable league, or it's bigger picture. Of course it is PIF financed. It shouldn't be, in my eyes, kind of measured and analysed really in the same way. I mean, the figures from last year shine a light on where the money's not coming from and how much, in some respects, that there hasn't been much of a business model, but that's changing, as we'll discuss. And also, if the framework agreement comes to pass, then, what will that create? That will create, if it happens, big if, a new collectively owned for-profit entity combining the businesses and rights of the PGA Tour, the DP World Tour, and LIV. So, all of a sudden, bigger picture, if they manage that and they get a seat at a combined golf league and get what they want from being part of a global tour, well, they are already a global tour, but you know what I mean. Then from Saudi Arabia investment point of view, it's a winner. This has been a necessary spend in order to get there. That could well be a moot point if it doesn't come to pass. And we may be here in 2 or 3 years looking at those finances and saying, when are they going to be profitable? But it has to be taken with that context.
So, Martin, can you talk us through the numbers? I mean, what we hear everywhere in the press is that the Saudis have invested up to or more than $5 billion in LIV Golf. Where do you think the business is going to go in 2025? Where does it stand?
Yeah, the revenue stream numbers are really interesting as to where the money's come from so far. I mean, I'm going to put you on the spot here, but of all the revenue streams you would get for a golf league, what would you put as their top revenue source of any kind of revenue that they get?
Well, I would think for LIV, because their media rights deals haven't perhaps been as good as expected, I would guess it would be from sponsorship and marketing, no? Am I right?
You will be right, I think, if we have the same conversation in a year. You're not right at the moment. At the moment, it's hosting fees. And I think this surprised people. So it's the five, I'll run you through them, but hosting fees were $26.6 million US in 2024, up from 13.6. That is on the back of a couple of big ones, Australia, Hong Kong. I mean, for a new sports league, that's pretty good going, in terms of hosting fees that they're deriving from the market. We don't know the US numbers. We think that Chicago has some state and city backing, so that there will be one there. Dallas doesn't, so I don't think there'll be a hosting fee there. But as I said, we don't have LIV Inc.'s numbers. LIV Golf Adelaide, I don't know if you've watched any of it on the television, but while some of the LIV events can rightly be criticised for, very few people being there, not LIV Golf Adelaide and not some of the others, it's massively well attended. 102,500 people went over 3 days this year. Partly because Australia doesn't have, a golf major. It doesn't have a really strong tour. So the locals love golf, and they have local, obviously, Cam Smith, Mark Leishman, have local players playing. So there's huge buy-in. So that is a reflection of that, but also maybe the kind of nascent stage we're at in terms of sponsorship, media rights, and so on for the rest of LIV Golf last year. Sponsorship in 2024 was $17.1 million US, up from 9.8. Then it was actually ticketing and hospitality, 13.2, up from 7.6. Broadcast rights, yeah, you're right. Because of broadcast rights, plan was really just to get it out there, get the product out there. It was only $2.8 million US in 2024, which was down from 3 million. Now, again, the caveat, this is a figure for the operations for the 7 international events. There was a different US TV deal last year, but not quite the whole picture. Merchandise, 2.6 million, up from 1.9. But maybe to give you an idea of where we think they're going under this. I mean, it's a new leadership. It's also really a new commercial look for them. They recently hired Chris Heck, who was at Aston Villa and the Red Bulls, as president in a commercial president role. There was a bunch of hires made public this week, including an EVP Global Head of Partnerships, Chad Biggs, who was at Harris Blitzer, Heather Meyer, who was SVP Marketing, Victoria Hawksley, who used to be at Spurs as a VP of Retail and Merch. So I would expect a shift this year. I would expect sponsorship to be the chief revenue stream in 2025, for sure, followed by either hosting or broadcast. I suppose the big change in broadcast that there's been this year, Fox come on board in the US, which is a very different deal to CW Network and level of exposure. There have been some international deals of note, Movistar in Spain, DAZN, and a global, almost a kind of global distribution deal, if you like, for LIV Golf Player. ITV's come on board in the UK. We know that ITV's not paying a rights fee, but that's an exposure play. The big one is sponsorship, though, as you almost rightly said at the beginning.
Almost.
We think, with a fair tailwind that, and listen, I suppose, carefully to the detail here, but they could be close to deals worth $500 million US over the course of their contract, the key line being over the course of the contract. So that's by the end of this year, if they get the deals done. They think they're going to get done, but the contract, they could be 2 years, they could be 3 years, 4 or 5 years. So that's certainly not an annualized figure. So, but interestingly, long term, I think LIV think that media could be their number one revenue source. I mean, there's a hell of a long way to go to get there, followed by sponsorship and then hosting and ticketing. That's more of, I think, a 5-year view that the LIV will be taking around where they think they can go. As you know, and you know the media rights market very well, and we did a golf report talking about this very thing, that would be a huge shift for a property that struggles in markets to get viewing figures of note, that a property that had to go up against PGA Tour and European Tour broadcasters who, and we know this was a case that some of them in the very early days of LIV did deals with LIV and then, or were told, no, actually, please don't. You're a long-term part of the European Tour. we don't expect you to go and do deals with LIV. The tensions around that have softened slightly since, but it's a tough market generally at the moment, of course, but even just building up from scratch a media property, as huge as the stars are who play for LIV, it would be some achievement to make media right the number one revenue source for LIV in 5 years' time.
And still the key issue is that golf fans want to see the top players playing against each other week in, week out, don't they? Rather than have to go to different platforms and different channels to see two different tours and have the stars not really play against each other, except in the majors and, as we saw recently, the Ryder Cup.
Yeah, they do. And that's why the Ryder Cup and the majors have benefited from that. I mean, there is an access issue for LIV with some of the majors because they're not getting world golf ranking points. So that remains an issue. But yeah, for sure, I personally speaking as a golf fan, I look forward to the majors now more than ever before. I do watch a bunch of LIV. I do probably watch more European Tour and PGA Tour. At the moment, I'm speaking in a personal capacity, not a professional capacity, just because I don't like being told, I suppose, regularly that something is really good. Maybe that's the Scottishness coming out in me. And the way that LIV, there is a host broadcast and there are on-site reporters. And, in the early days of LIV, there would be on-site reporters interviewing Greg Norman to ask him how great LIV was. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but I'm not a big fan of that. I like being introduced to a product and, can make my mind up whether I like it or not. But yeah, listen, I am not in my teens or 20s, and certainly going to a LIV event or watching it on telly or on YouTube is a disruptive, fun experience for many. I'm just an old stick in the mud, to be honest, but it is very different and it looks very different, and the tech is really good. All around the shot trackers and tech, and others have copied LIV in many respects. So it's just whatever you prefer. Which one have you watched, Catherine?
Well, to be quite honest, I don't watch golf. I don't even have sports channels. I don't even watch TV at all, really. That's a shameful thing to admit. But I must say that I do watch YouTube, and I introduced my daughters, who are in their 20s, to some of the golf stars, particularly Bryson DeChambeau and his hole-in-one challenge over his house, which I thought was brilliant. And I'm one of the many billions of people who watched that series on YouTube. So I think they've done some things really well to bring in the youth, which is what, golf may need. I don't know what the median age of a golf viewer is on Sky in the UK, but it's probably edging up towards 50. So if they're bringing in the youth through all these YouTube shorts and so forth, then that's got to be a good thing for LIV to try and get an advantage or to try and make some headway in the tough field.
I mean, certainly the PGA Tour has kind of reacted in that respect in terms of how they're working with influencers and so on, but LIV,
they certainly have.
Are really, it's a big focus, clearly, in terms of how they position themselves.
Well, Martin, we've done a lot of golf and a lot of numbers, a lot of financial reports. Do you think it's time to wrap this up and move on to something a little bit more lighthearted?
100%.
Right. Well, we will take a short break and we'll be back to the fun part of the podcast. Don't go away.
Stay ahead in the business of sport with trusted news, data, and analysis across media rights, sponsorship, and more. Explore our subscription options at sportbusiness.com.
We're back again, Martin Ross and I, to deal with the final section of the Sport Business Podcast. And this is the fun bit. Martin, you've got something that you're looking at with a review to the week ahead. Tell me what you've got in mind.
Yeah, well, I dipped into the Disney Plus coverage of the start of the league phase, the new league phase of the UEFA Women's Champions League. So I am looking ahead to doing so again next week. Second round of matches, maybe PSG, Real Madrid. Believe it or not, I watched the Arsenal-Lyon match and I was kind of stunned. I mean, there's been a lot of hype about, obviously, the coverage, and we've written a lot about the deal. Frank Dunn had discussed with Imran and Maria on his Inside the Deal podcast, how it came about. And I think it's kind of really interesting that it's kind of fills a void in the scheduling in the evenings for Disney Plus users, with kids watching cartoons during the day, and then, they can watch this in the evening. But I was kind of a bit taken aback watching it and this may sound like a very small thing, but can be important for a kind of viewer who could be swayed into watching or not watching and isn't a kind of hardcore women's football fan. I was unable to pause or rewind on the match, which I found a bit odd because, you would expect to be able to in any other. It must be a small rights restriction. I'd love to know how. So if anybody from Two Circles or from ESPN or UEFA who can explain us why this is an issue. But even more geeky, you're able to change the language, which is really cool. So I was able to watch the game this particular game in English, in French, in Norwegian, in Swedish, and in Dutch. And if I watched it in English and French, couldn't pause, couldn't rewind, if I flipped it to any of the other languages, all of a sudden I could pause it and rewind it and go to the start of the game. Anyway, a very long-winded way of saying that if I'm watching a Women's Champions League game or any football game, I think I expect that ability, and not being able to do so and check back on what's happened during the game or the little watermarks for goals and so on is a bit of a turn-off. So I'm wondering whether that's a rights issue, whether that can be sorted. But yeah, viewing experience is everything when you think of all the different alternatives you've got among all the streamers. It needs to be really all bells and whistles in my view.
But at least you know you can do that if you watch it in Norwegian. Right?
Yes. If I watch it in Norwegian and harness my inner Bodo Glimt, I am absolutely fine. Although, well, I did do it the next night and I tried it in Norwegian for another game and that didn't work. There's either a whole rights matrix going on or something's not working at the back end at Disney OTT. Not
Which
sure.
could very well be, but
Answers on a postcard.
hopefully they're listening and they may sort it out once they listen to this podcast.
Answers in Norwegian from Bodo Glimt.
Your favorite team north of the Arctic Circle, right? Well, I wanted to go to a completely different part of the sports universe now. I wanted to talk about Bad Bunny. I do. And I'm saying this, and it's all very relevant because Jon just mentioned that he was at the Yankees game in the final game of the American League Division Series, Game 4. Game 3, Toronto had, I'm going to use the Canadian term again, Toronto Blue Jays had skunked the Yankees in the first 2 games of the American League Division Series. In Game 3 in the Bronx, Bad Bunny was sitting right behind the pitcher. He actually got hit on the head by a foul ball, and he caught it, and in the moment went viral. And the Yankees pulled back from 6-1 down and won the game. Yankees' hopes were up all over the place. Bad Bunny didn't show up for the game, but Jon did, and they lost. And so now the Blue Jays are through to the American League Championship Series and hoping for a stab at the World Series, which they last won in 1993. But the thing about Bad Bunny, there's some political blowback there that we will not go into, but he has recently been named, as we know, as the Super Bowl halftime act for the Super Bowl in February. And this is a bit of a move by the NFL because we're talking about median age of an NFL viewer in the States is closing in on 50. And Bad Bunny he's the second most streamed artist in the world with 94.2 lead streams. Taylor Swift has 107 billion.
Wow.
Bad Bunny has 92.4 billion. And he appeals to the young, the Latino. He's global. And as we know, the NFL is playing its international games in Sao Paulo, Madrid, Mexico City. So it's a really interesting play by the NFL, bringing in Bad Bunny for their halftime act. Leaving aside the political connotations, because there's been a lot in the States, he's kind of the talk of the town. He's a Yankees fan. He's apparently also a Mets fan. He's a New York Knicks fan. He's playing at the Super Bowl. What do you say about that?
Flummoxed. I'm going to guess that the crossover between Bad Bunny and linear golf viewers over 50 is quite low. I'd never heard of him. Would you have heard of him if you didn't have 2 daughters in their early 20s? Well, I'm not sure they've heard of him either. It's not their thing, but I have heard of him because being in North America, it does hit the airwaves. And because the Toronto Blue Jays had that brush with him, he was a force in them losing Game 3. And the Blue Jays now, of course, are Canada's team. I mean, the Raptors were Canada's team in 2019 when they won the NBA championship. The Toronto FC were Canada's team when they won Major League Soccer. And so it depends, which league you're in and who's doing well at the moment. But right now, the Blue Jays are Canada's team, so we have heard about Bad Bunny. There you go. Excellent. I feel nourished by this information.
That's our cultural education for today for our listeners. Now, I think you had some other news. You were going to talk about tales of social media done well and done badly. Hit us with that.
Which one would you like first? Good or bad?
I want good first.
Good. Okay. Well, the good is, and I shared this video with you earlier this week, and I just love it. It
was very good.
It is. Well, I'll tell you where to go to find it first. You get onto TikTok, which I'm sure all of our listeners are. It's at Laurent, LAURENT.MA. He is I think he's French. He's certainly French speaking. Describes himself as fun photo and weddings. Anyway, on the 5th on his grid is a wonderful video of a wedding, guests all lined up in proper wedding gear. The bride is from Estonia, I think. The groom is from France. Hope I've got that right. And it pans along, and essentially, you maybe guess it, they play the Champions League theme tune, but they're so up for it. They are pretending to do the kind of stretches, the kind of the neck movement that you do before a game, and maybe the kind of praying. And then there's an exchange of flags, which is like the exchange of pennants between the bride and groom, and they kiss, and then they all kind of run off at the end. Sounds a bit corny. It's brilliant. Give it a watch. I know that this has kind of been done. Somebody sent me one of a lineup of taxi drivers in an airport with the placards, and they just kind of went along and did the same thing with the Champions League theme. But I mean, just goes to show how strong a brand. We did talk about this in the previous podcast as to whether you would. I think Frank controversially said he would get rid of the Champions League name. I mean, surely not. It is absolute gold, and yeah, what a strong brand all this time on. And social media done badly. Yeah, a tale from not my favourite football team in Glasgow. AI done badly. Yeah, I mean, we've spoken about how much is a huge thing, clearly, in the industry. But Dafabet, Celtic's shirt sponsor, after the game, I think on Saturday, decided to put out an AI image of Celtic, from a Celtic star player, Japanese striker DAZN Maeda, won man of the match, and they kind of sponsored the man of the match. Instead of, they did take a picture of him in front of the Dafabet branding at the match, which they could have used. They didn't use that. It looks like they went to Grok or a similar app and created an AI image of DAZN Maeda with a Dafabet champagne, but complete with, if anybody who's used Grok or others, like the badge just was way off, nowhere near it. His fingers kind of weren't really gripping the bottle properly, and it was just a huge own goal. The Celtic fans picked up on it pretty quickly. It was taken down. No doubt the club quite rightly got in touch with their main sponsor and said, what is going on? And subsequently, I think a picture went up of the actual DAZN Maeda with his champagne in front of the Dafabet branding. So yeah, AI being used badly in the industry.
AI or A1, as some people would call it, wouldn't they?
My dad called it A1. He read out a text and called it A1 earlier this week, which was showing his age. But there we go.
Yeah, there was a US politician this week who also referred to it as A1. Now that we've got that straight, and we all know a bit more about Bad Bunny, which I think was missing from a lot of our listeners' lives, and we've looked at a lot of numbers, some really key financial reports out that you have delved deep into. Thank you for coming on, and to Frank, who left us earlier, but who was very insightful with our DAZN commentary. And I think we pretty much wrapped it up for this week, haven't we, Martin? Thank you very much. And we will end our podcast for this week. We will be back next week with more, and in 2 weeks' time, we will be coming to you from the SportTel conference in Monaco. Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in, and we will see you next week. To our listeners, if you want to know more about today's stories or any of our other reports and analyses, and especially if you're looking for the world's largest collection of accurate sports rights feeds across media and sponsorship, you know where to go. Take a look at subscription options on our website or get in touch with us via email at info@sportbusiness.com. And as always, if you enter the code SBPodcast30 at the checkout, and that's SBPodcast30, you'll get a 30% discount on annual and monthly Sport Business subscriptions. Please don't forget to share your thoughts on this episode and give us your feedback in a review on the Apple Podcast and Spotify platforms. And watch for our weekly LinkedIn posts promoting the podcast, where, of course, you can leave a comment. Thank you all for tuning in, for reading, for subscribing. I'm Catherine Davies, and we'll be back again next week with the Sport Business Podcast.